This month is Lyme Disease Awareness Month, and today's guest, Dr. Diane Mueller, is an expert when it comes to Lyme. We dive really deep into where to start when you have Lyme disease, mold illness, and multiple other downstream effects from these conditions, because knowing where to start treatment can really be the challenging piece when it comes to chronic illness.
Right. And there's so many components of that treatment. So, Melissa, I agree. And I was particularly inspired by Dr. Diane's wealth of knowledge and confidence. She speaks to when do we address metabolic health, lifestyle detox, and microbe balancing with antimicrobials, which can oftentimes be so confusing for functional medicine providers. And we also touch on libido and how not only it can be impacted by these chronic conditions, but how it might also be one of the keys to healing from these conditions as well. So let's jump into it and get started. Hello and welcome back to the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. I'm Dr. Emmy Brown here with my fantastic co-host, Melissa Gentile. Today we are joined by an extraordinary guest, Dr. Diane Mueller, naturopathic doctor and doctor of acupuncture and oriental medicine, international speaker, and best-selling author. Through her clinics, My Lyme Doc and My Libido Doc, Dr. Diane addresses chronic infections and toxins as well as intimate hormonal imbalances, helping patients reclaim their vitality and zest for life. And if that wasn't enough, she also offers business coaching programs that help female entrepreneurs find clients and build sustainable, high-impact businesses. Hey, quick question for our listeners. What do Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Andy Galpin, and Dr. Rhonda Patrick all have in common? They're all keynote speakers of the Vibrant Longevity Summit. Join us in San Jose, September 27th through the 28th for an unparalleled opportunity to explore the future of health and longevity. Don't miss out on the chance to learn from the best. Register now at www.vibrant-longevity-summit.com. Dr. Diane is also the author of two-time bestseller, It's Not in Your Mind, Solutions and Strategies for Lyme Disease, Mold Illness, and Chronic Infections. So let's get into it. I'm so excited. Welcome, Dr. Diane.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to get into this information too, and to hopefully give people some really exciting new ways of looking at these tough chronic patients.
Yes, we love all the new and cutting edge, so we'll definitely get there. First things first, I would love to know origin stories in naturopathic medicine are one of my favorite things. So I'm curious, how did you find naturopathic medicine, and were you familiar with it before you became unwell? Because I know you have a personal healing journey of your own. And if that was the case, what field were you working in before?
Thanks, Dr. Emmy. Yeah, I started being very curious about medicine, about holistic health, nutrition, those sorts of things. Not truly naturopathic medicine, but about natural health in my late teens. And that was because I had chronic constipation, irritable bowel syndrome. That was just one of these things we see over and over again, people going to so many doctors and all the tests are normal and we know there's a problem, right? And so it was pretty uncomfortable back then. I would travel and sometimes not know if I needed to bring a size 4 or a size 12 with me when I would travel because of the level of distension in my body. So I didn't know anything about naturopathic medicine back then. So I actually went to school. My undergrad originally was in finance. And as my gastrointestinal symptoms were getting worse, that was eventually what led me to switch my track and start studying more holistic medicine. As far as I was then going to be a dietitian was what I was most my plan. And an amazing woman sat next to me in my organic chemistry lab, and she was getting ready to start applying, going down the road of naturopathic medicine. And she was my lab partner. And so she told me about naturopathic medicine. And that's really where it all began. And so it started with just, yes, like so many of us that go into these naturopathic fields, it did start with my own illness, but it started just with gastrointestinal symptoms, really. And it wasn't until I got into ND school that I started having really strange symptoms that really led me down the Lyme and the mold track.
Is that what inspired you to also complete a double doctorate? Because you also have your doctorate in oriental medicine and acupuncture. Just having more
I
options, I wonder?
I just love learning, and we
Yeah.
had my first acupuncture or my first naturopathic school. I started at Southwest College in Arizona, where they actually do train in acupuncture as naturopaths. And it's just a small amount of training there. But I actually just found those classes so inspirational. And I just loved them so much that it just became one of those things of, as a lifelong learner, I just sort of couldn't help myself. So then I ended up continuing and adding on the master's and the doctorate in Chinese medicine as well. Yep.
It just gives you more tools also. So it's
Totally. Yeah,
great.
exactly. And it's nice to look at the body from both lens, right? We do so much in medicine around test, test, test. And I'm a huge proponent of like science and tests and not guessing. And when we look at the body according to Chinese medicine principles, we really understand, for example, that certain infections have this like heat nature
Mm.
and other infections have this more cold nature as we describe them in oriental medicine. And we can take two antimicrobial properties or two antimicrobial treatments, I should say, and one might do better for a certain microorganism and a certain presentation of that microorganism if it's, say, a hot presentation as Chinese medicine would define that. Then we're going to want to use cooling antimicrobial herbs versus the opposite. So it allows for a level 2 beyond even our herbal formulary, like the herbs that we talk about in naturopathic medicine. It allows me to take those herbs and think about them also according to these Chinese medicine principles, which is really cool as far as building treatment protocols that are a little more unique and dialed to the individual and their specific symptom presentation. Because as we know in all the things we're going to talk about today, two people can present with the exact same, say, lab test, but of course they're not going to have the exact same symptom presentation.
And actually,
Right.
speaking on infections, I do want to start it out with Lyme disease because that's one of your big specialties here. So, kind of zooming out and like backtracking a little bit, if I was someone listening in that maybe wasn't super familiar with Lyme disease, and I just kind of associated it with tick bites, can you kind of explain high level and also with Lyme disease? Do all patients get a rash with their tick bites? Do they all get that bullseye rash? And are tick bites the only way to contract Lyme?
Thank you for all of these questions. Yes. So, high level Lyme disease is a bacterial infection. So, bacterial infection caused by a species called Borrelia burgdorferi. Although, this is where we're going to get into some semantics here in a little while because there are some testing things that I think we need to point out with the definition of Lyme high level Borrelia burgdorferi, but I'll save that for a little while. So essentially, other high level things in addition to this being a bacteria is yes, it does come from bites of ticks. However, there's a few different things. There's limited studies. There's a couple studies, very, very, very limited right now, that are indicating that perhaps fleas and mosquitoes also can carry Borrelia. And another important thing to understand is so many people feel like, well, I've never had a tick bite. Well, what can happen is ticks can actually have multiple feedings. And so they transmit most of their disease at the very end of when they're actually feeding on blood. And so,
Mhm.
for example, if somebody is walking and they get a tick bite and the tick stays on them for a while, and then somebody else gets another tick bite and it falls off, that second person is going to be more likely impacted and that tick can fall off. But the other thing with that that's important is so many people think, oh, I found this tick. I went walking in the woods today. It was only on me for 2 hours. I'm fine. Well, yes, disease transmission does take a while, but if that person was that second person to actually get bitten by that same tick, it can only be on us for a couple hours and it could be in that very tail end of its disease transmission. And then we essentially get that bacteria that is transmitted and get the disease. And then to answer the third part of your question, when we're talking about the rash and symptoms, not everybody gets the rash. In fact, well less than half, probably more about round about a third of people actually get that classic target lesion bullseye rash. And some people get it in places they don't check, such as in their like on their scalp, right? You can be bitten. It's a common place to be bitten is on your scalp. Well, you're not going to see a rash likely under hair unless you're bald, right? And then it would obviously show up more. But essentially, because of all those reasons, so many times that acuteness of that infection, of that bacterial infection, will actually manifest looking like a flu. And people get fever, flu like symptoms. They think it's the flu. It's self limiting. It resolves. And I'm saying that in air quotes because it resolves enough to basically go dormant where there's not symptoms. And like we know about a lot of these stealth pathogens that we call them, these ones that can kind of hide and go dormant and hide in our cells, it can actually reemerge later on and cause so much inflammation and so many immune problems that it winds up manifesting as brain fog, as pain, as arthritis, as fibromyalgia, as all these other symptoms. And nobody is thinking about Lyme because it's so far past an infection, even if somebody did realize that they had it.
So with the complexity of like the diagnosis process, I know getting diagnosed with Lyme disease can be a really long and it almost sounds like a frustrating process because it's like you don't really know where it's coming from, you don't know if you have it, you're looking at other conditions. So how do you address the mental emotional effects of the illness? You're probably getting patients in that come to you, they're like, I've seen 15 different doctors, I've done 15 different tests, I've spent all this money. They're kind of burnt out at that point. How do you handle a patient in that initial consult?
I think the most important things to say about that, because that is the most common person that walks into my office, is that somebody that has seen a dozen plus different doctors, maybe they have this diagnosis or they don't, but either way, they're frustrated and they've spent a lot of time, effort, and money. And more commonly, I actually find that people will come in with a diagnosis and they've seen all these doctors. And what can happen is once we have a diagnosis like Lyme, it's very, very, very common for doctors to get presented, say, a positive test if we're lucky enough. And I say that again cautiously, but lucky enough meaning we know this is happening. We know one reason for the symptoms. And so we can show up and have this diagnosis. And then because of that diagnosis explains all the symptoms. So often professionals, they don't actually look deeper than that to say, well, is it Lyme plus Bartonella plus Babesia, these other infections? Is it mycotoxins? Are there heavy metals? Are there glyphosates? There are other environmental chemicals there. And so the diagnosis sometimes is only one part of the problem because we're seeing all these other doctors who are focused on all these advanced treatments. And it's like, well, what's the magic treatment? Well, the magic treatment is actually getting all of the root causes. So during that process, there's so many, levels, yes, where the mind does come up. And it's really tricky in thinking about the mind and the disease process because we know, for example, that adrenaline, this neurotransmitter, this brain hormone that gets activated during stress. And anytime we're chronically ill and we're trying to fight for our lives, of course we're chronically stressed, right? So we know that adrenaline, when it gets secreted in a higher amount, we know that it causes the biofilms of all the bacteria, such as Lyme bacteria, to get stronger. And that strength can help those biofilms communicate better,
That's
can help with
wild.
their survival and proliferation and all that, right? So it's a vicious cycle. I really describe the mind body balance with this as like a chicken and the egg, right? Because it's so easy sometimes for people to be like, well, it's not in my mind. It's not in my mind. And it's not in your mind. Like that's why it's like the title of my book, because it's not. And the power of the mind to actually help people get out of that vicious cycle where we get stressed and then we secrete more adrenaline. The adrenaline worsens the disease, and then we feel worse. So we get more stressed and worried and chicken and egg it out, And so from there, it really does become a level of commitment of tiny habits I love the Atomic Habits work by James Clear, really looking at how every day we can bring various things of vagal nerve work, of mindset retraining. Like in my work, I have created a 30-day hack your mind reset, and it's exercises that I've learned after studying meditation and Qigong for over 20 years. So I've kind of put all of this together in my own version of a course. There's so many amazing things out there, Gupta and DNRS. There's a lot of things that are out there that are really doing a great job of training the nervous system. But I do find that it is an essential part of people's care when they come in. And there's this mindset is one, hope, helping, share stories of people that have recovered because there's a lot of them, staying off of these internet chat rooms where it's people sharing all of their horror stories because we don't hear the good stories on those things, right? Because everybody is and people, once they're well, they don't go back onto those platforms and complain because they're well. So it's just kind of breaking down those habits and really starting people on a day-to-day way and a plan of resetting their nervous system.
That's essential. I imagine that's really at the center of a lot of what you do, but also there are so many other aspects. And on your website, Dr. Diane, you mentioned the matrix that you use to help address chronic conditions. Can you talk to us about that approach?
Yeah, so it's a 4-phase process, and this is the matrix that I use really as kind of the foundation for chronic disease. Of course, within any matrix or with any model, I really am an advocate for like this is the guiding principles. And then of course we have to listen to people's body. But from a standpoint of the 4 phase, so phase one is really about building up the body. So so many people when they have had decades of various types of chronic symptoms, we have so many things that get broken in the process. Like I've never seen a Lyme mold, heavy mold mycotoxin patient with normal adrenal function, with normal thyroid function, right? That doesn't really happen. And sometimes it's like severe and more severe than others. But we see so many hormones, we see so many glands, we see so many micronutrient deficiencies, see so much attack on the mitochondria when we have these disease processes that it becomes essential to build people back up because that building phase is really to say, hey, if we come in, for example, and we just start detoxing, and we know from all of our biochemistry that detox is going to take, depending upon the pathway, different B vitamins and zinc and selenium and so many different nutrients. And if we come in and we don't have those nutrients to actually detox, and we are asking the liver and all of the detox pathways throughout the body to say essentially move faster, it's not going to work if we don't have those foundational things. And so that building up is really that prep phase to say, let's help the adrenals get back online. Let's help the thyroid get back online. Let's help the micronutrient levels come into balance. It really makes a difference when we get into later phase 3 and phase 4, which are the healing the infections and getting rid of the toxins. So that first phase in the matrix is that building.
Mhm.
Second phase I actually put is lifestyle. So this is where so many people by the time they get to me, as I think a lot of people that work with naturopathic and functional clinicians already have an understanding of, diet. They're already oftentimes on organic and gluten-free and dairy-free and just really they've already taken out a lot of the foods that are the common inflammatory foods.
Sure.
And so many people, of course, don't have good sleep hygiene and their lymphatic system's not moving. And we have all these other things. And so I put lifestyle in the matrix after that building because I have found in working with complex diseases like this, we can't ask somebody most of the time to say, hey, let's go out and let's start lymphatic massaging or rebounding and taking Epsom salt baths or doing sauna or Rife or all the other lifestyle things if they don't even have energy to brush their teeth.
Mhm.
Right. So it's like that building up, and then we start working on the lifestyle. And from there, I move people from there into detox and to, working on all the pathways, the skin, the gallbladder, the liver. I don't work on typically as much of the detox pathways of the gut from a standpoint of killing infections and SIBO and, all those things until phase 4. And
Mhm.
I tend to wait in the matrix to phase 4 to really do that killing phase because anytime we kill microorganisms, they of course release their toxins. And if we can't even detox and our detox pathways are built backed up, that hurts that die off type of reaction where we feel worse before we feel better, which I am not a fan of. And I really think it's important to avoid as much as possible. If
Mhm.
we do all these stages first and then work on the infections at that kind of end part of the matrix, I find that works so much better from a reactivity standpoint for people. And I go through all of that in detail in my book as well.
That was my next question because that's hugely valuable to have that stepwise approach, and I'm sure there's way more detail in the book. It's on my list to read for sure. And it makes sense because we as functional medicine practitioners, we talk about all these things, of course, but laying the foundation in a very thoughtful, comprehensive way is really, I think, going to be a matter of hit or miss in so many of these cases. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I love that
Exactly.
you put so much emphasis on the prep work because so many people wanna dive into head first into detoxing and not realize, like, you can make yourself really sick if your body's not, prepped properly. But I do wanna switch gears a little bit and kinda shift into mold illness because I know that can go hand in hand sometimes with Lyme. I do wanna pick that apart. So, starting kind of high level again with mold, what are some of the telltale signs that someone might be dealing with mold illness opposed to something else? Because I know there's probably a lot of overlap, especially with things like fatigue and brain fog. I mean, when someone has that, it could be anything.
It's a really tricky thing to dissect, and it's a really tricky thing to dissect, especially between mold and Lyme. Like other things are easier to dissect, I would say, from a standpoint of symptoms. So I'll break this down with what I mean. Because Lyme, the Borrelia, that bacteria infection, as well as mycotoxins, the toxins from mold, because they have the ability to inflame our system so severely, because they have the ability to do things like attack our nerves and even cause nerves to die, because we often see things such as a lowering of molecules like basal endothelial growth factor. And so then we get a shortening and a lessening of the circulatory system to our tissues. So we see like inflammatory molecules, nervous system molecules, circulatory system being affected by both Borrelia as well as mycotoxins. And because these systems I'm talking about go throughout our entire body, it's the symptom picture is widespread. So the way I like to look at this is like kind of the clinical pearl or red flag, we would say, with thinking about Lyme and mold and kind of lumping them together as either one could be major possibilities really is when you're looking at patients and you're saying, wow, like if I were to send people to like a conventional, like go the conventional route, they would have to see a gastroenterologist, a rheumatologist, an endocrinologist, and you're like naming all the ologists, and you're like, there's like 10 ologists that we have to see because all the different organ systems that are involved. That's a big red flag, right? So if it's really like as simple as, wow, this person mostly has gastrointestinal illness, like maybe a few other symptoms, but most things really are focused in their gut. Yes, we can see Lyme can attack the vagus nerve. It's very common with mycotoxin illness for the gut to be infected as well. Nausea is a very common symptom with mycotoxin illness. But most of the time, if we're dealing with Lyme or mold, we are going to see much more like, well, yeah, it's my gut and, right? So that's really how I say that there is like, it's just multi-systemic. Between Lyme and mold, there are a few classic, I would say, like textbook things. But of course, all of us know that people are not textbooks. But if we're really, getting into textbook definition, and I do find some people present this way, like it's why it is textbook, but a lot of people don't as well, which is pain, which is common with either of these conditions. Pain with Lyme tends to migrate. It's in the shoulder, it's in the knee, it's in the hip, and it's like day to day, it's going to be different. Lyme, I also find to be the severity threshold to be dramatically different around like, oh, wow, one day is a 10 out of 10. The next day is a 4 out of 10. It can be maddening. Periods of like, maybe it's a little better. Oh, crap. It's like actually getting worse. Versus mold, I tend to see like, yes, there's oscillations day to day, but textbook speaking, oftentimes like not as severe. The pain doesn't tend to move from place to place. It is where it is. It might more commonly be in smaller joints, your arthritis types of joints, your fingers, your wrists, those sorts of things. But again, that's super textbook. So I think in the end, and it really just comes down to the best way is like if you're seeing widespread disease, you're seeing widespread symptoms, that's where we really have to get into the testing because it truly is not something that we can sort out without a little more data.
It's a good segue into talking about testing. And before we do that, though, this kind of siloing of medicine in terms of the specialties, as you mentioned, I think that answers my next question. But mold illness is so oftentimes overlooked in the allopathic setting. And I think that's a big part of it. But is there anything else that you think, maybe in terms of different genetic susceptibility between individuals? What are other reasons why mold illness gets so overlooked and there's really no diagnostic code for it at this point or official way to work it up?
We're definitely don't have like the funding and the research into studies the way that we need to. So there's a few different things, right? So there's a few different things. One is certainly the genetic predisposition where people do have certain genes, like you're saying, where they are more susceptible to mold. And the reason they're more susceptible to mold is what's actually changing genetically. This change is really in our immune system. And the change in our immune system, the simplest way to, not get into our weeds with all the immune technical words is really to say the immune system loses its ability to tag mold toxins as bad. And when that happens due to this genetic anomaly, it's almost like the immune system and the detoxification system does not see the mold toxins.
Mm.
So I don't think there's been a near enough study. I mean, I think it's very clear there's not been near enough study on that. Plus, we can also see so much in molds as far as what we're taught in the public. And I think there's just this huge denial because I really think if we were to look at mold illness the way it would need to be looked at, think about how much it would have to deconstruct our entire way that we're building.
Mhm.
It affects so many industries and it's like simple things, right? Like I'm working on moving and purchasing a house right now, so I'm doing all sorts of home mold tests and doing all the things that I recommend to my patients. I'm
Yeah.
I'm doing now. And I was under contract for one just a week ago. And I knew just going under contract and being there during the inspection, I was there for 3 hours. And I had very, very like classic symptoms that anytime around mold, I start getting like really sweaty and hot. And it'll be like a 60-degree day. And I'm just like profusely sweating is one of my early
Wow.
mold symptoms. So all this is happening. I'm getting this very specific headache I only get with mold, yada, yada. And of course, like the initial air samples that they test, I was running tests beyond that. But of course, like the initial air samples that were tested, they're like, oh, yeah, fine, like zero risk, right?
Mhm.
So, point being, I think one of the problems we're running into with why there's not this level of acceptance is also from a standpoint of mold illness is just frankly like socially, personally, it's like such a hard thing to accept and when people get a diagnosis like this and they're living and their house is making them sick, it can be it can just be like mind boggling to try to work oneself out of this. And I thought, so what I even see clinically, it's so easy for patients to be like, I don't even want to look at this because it's
Yeah.
so hard. And I think because of that, because of almost there's this internal, almost social denial around it being a problem and when there's a social denial around it, it does make it harder for more awareness to get to it, to I think really get like the research and study that would be the most beneficial. Because we're going to have to completely, if people really become aware of this, we're going to have to deconstruct so many different things about how we are living as humans.
It's just dismantling a whole lifestyle and whole building kind of practices, and it is wild when you go down that rabbit hole, but and I'm curious real quick, I imagine your book, Dr. Diane, goes into maybe some practical tips, like, it doesn't have to be this huge, intimidating process, at least, testing the home up front, understanding how to do that properly. Is that information in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's stuff in there about like what to do if you suspect a moldy home, how to avoid, simple things like make sure the grading around your house is not negatively graded, meaning you want that grading, you want that slope away from your house, not towards your house.
Mhm.
And the number of like times I see that personally and professionally like not done, it's really common. So some of those basic tips. And then there's also, I try to balance a combination of being soft and like this doesn't have to be so hard. Also, truthfully, with also a directness of
Yeah.
sometimes it is a find that will in you of I am strong, I am a survivor, and really finding that will because it doesn't have to be that hard sometimes. And other times it is really hard. But the thing that does not work is when we're in denial and we're like, I don't want to look at this. That's the worst, of all the decisions, that's the absolute worst because, it's a definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing and expecting different results. And if we're just living and pretending like nothing's wrong with our home and we have evidence that it is, sometimes it truly is, it is really hard. But sometimes that's literally the only way to get out of the dementia, the brain fog, the all the crazy symptoms. And we see with some of these mycotoxins, we see links in research for scary things like Alzheimer's and other scary neurological diseases, MS, right? So it's like we want to take this seriously because while it's scary and while sometimes it is literally crawling oneself out of a very, very, very deep mold hole,
Mhm.
it is still the better option. It's one of those scenarios of like A and B options, and neither one of these options are good, but which one is gonna actually get you your life back?
Right, and you gotta start somewhere, so
Yeah.
And I'm sure the approach with different patients is going to vary, but I'm wondering about the folks who love data, the objective data on paper. So we talked about home testing a little bit, but what about laboratory testing for your patients? What do you kind of like to do for working up mold? And does that help maybe incentivize patients to do the deeper work when it comes to the home and the lifestyle changes?
100%. Like lab work, we have to do it. So we have labs on the home, we have labs on the body. And for the body, we definitely like Vibrant's urinary mycotoxin test. And I say this, you guys, don't give me any money for saying this. So I say this out of my own just love for your guys' test because it's the most thorough test on the market. And that's really, and I see it's not uncommon, right, for me to see somebody come into my office that has done a different urinary mycotoxin test where they're only doing, say, 4 or 5 different markers. And then I run a Vibrant urinary mycotoxin test, and all of a sudden, I have results. I have data. I have evidence. And when we see that, and what happens a lot of times, we run a test called an ERMI test on the house, which is a dust sample. Since most of the really bad molds, well, they're in air and dust, but most of the really bad ones are heavy, so they don't suspend in air super long. So we really want those dust samples. And so when we do like an ERMI, for example, dust sample, and we can show people, and I will go back and forth and be like, this is your ERMI, this is your home, this is your body, right? And it does, you're absolutely right from a standpoint of inspiring people. You're absolutely right. It can really, really inspire people like, oh, here's the data.
Mhm.
Sometimes too is why I created my online quiz at getwellquiz.com. I created that because for a few different reasons, but one of them too, it's if we're having a hard time inspiring a patient to actually get a lab test run, the point of that is to basically point people in the top 3 of all these functional tests, the top 3 biggest things that could be actually coming up from a testing perspective. So that's another way of just like, okay, they're not, people aren't willing to do a test yet. Go take this. Let this other data point, guide you. So as many data points as possible. And then I do wind up most of the time for most people with these widespread symptoms. Most of the time, it really is a combination of a tick-borne test and the urinary mycotoxin test, both because the symptoms are so similar. And I do see that people get into this cycle, right, where sometimes I think that moving into a home that is moldy might actually be what is waking up dormant Lyme. Right,
Mm.
so it's like it's almost like these 2 conditions sometimes and can emerge simultaneously, which can also confuse the clinical picture unless we test.
You brought up, you sparked another question of mine because we're talking so much about mold in our environment. Like you said, moving into a moldy home, it's in the dust, it's getting into your body. What about dietary mold? What about coffee? What about all these things that we're consuming, grains that we're not thinking about?
It's a really important thing to realize that there are mycotoxins in these things. It's also a really important thing to realize that this is not going to cause the disease. And I say that because I've talked to clinicians that have done actual in clinic studies where they basically had urinary mycotoxin tests done on a bunch of people, removed these foods, then done repeats and no change pre and post. And then the same thing, done urinary mycotoxin test, given people a bunch of these foods, and then again, no change. So I do find that it is important because sometimes food can be a trigger to people, right? And sometimes, and whether it's because their mycotoxin threshold is just so high, and any tiny little exposure is just like bad. Whether it's they actually have more of a sensitivity or a allergy, some sort of immunological reaction, and they're hypersensitized to the food. Sometimes getting that food out can be a useful thing, but I have never, ever, ever, ever in all of my clinical years of doing this, and I'm almost 15 years in, I've never seen anybody actually make a change significantly to their health, both, from a lab or a symptom picture just with food. And a lot of my colleagues that I talk to that are it comes up a lot. And the same thing goes for every single colleague I've talked to as well. So it's good to know, but unfortunately, there's just so many studies out there that that's all they talk about. And so, sometimes people will come in and be like, well, I got this, mycotoxin test and I don't want to do my home. I'm just going to stop eating peanuts and oats and barley.
Mhm.
And so while it's like useful to know that those things do contain it, it's also really important for people to understand that that is not, I never guarantee anything in medicine, but I can almost guarantee that is not going to do much for really truly reversing the symptoms as well as seeing those urinary mycotoxin tests return to normal.
And Dr. Diane, this makes me think of the fact that remediation is another one of these very intimidating pieces of the puzzle here. And I imagine patients have all sorts of degrees of mold exposure, depending on where they're living, what the home looks like. Is there a case wherein they can use a dehumidifier? Is it so mild that we can do something that doesn't involve an extreme remediation? Have you seen any of those cases where there's some kind of more approachable tips to get the mold count down and people clinically get better?
It's a really important question. So, essentially, finding a mold free place is largely going to be impossible, right? We're not trying to get mold free places. We're trying to get mold in our homes, in our offices, and places we're spending a lot of time below a certain threshold
Mhm.
that's going to trigger our immune system. So, that's what we're really trying to do here. So, the biggest problems I see is when people come up and they are above that threshold and actually try to DIY it. So I would not recommending DIY it as much as it's like, oh, I'm going to do, you read about these foggers online and, like dehumidifies, like you said, like those are great things for prevention. Those are great things to prevent there being a problem. And those are great things to use like professionals, what they'll do in when they come in, like a really good, somebody that really understands mold illness will come in to a home and they will find it and they will contain it. And then in that contained space, they will oftentimes fog the air, clean the air, sometimes also do it in the non-contained space just so everything's super clean. But they're doing it while containing it because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is so many of these techniques, these home DIY techniques, make things worse. Like bleach is a really great one. So, a really great example. So, we throw bleach on something because we think, oh my gosh, it's mold. I have to kill it. Well, few different things. One, bleach will actually make the mold spores go into the air because mold, like any microorganism, is trying to survive. So we pour bleach on it, and it's like, oh, I got to survive. So as some of those mold spores are dying, they go into the air. Now, while some of the mold spores will die, bleach is actually part chemical, part water. So whichever mold does not, the bleach does not kill, the water of the bleach has actually fed that microorganism.
Mm.
And the same thing goes for any of these other types of home mold remedies like the fogger. It's like if we're not containing it, that's what I'm saying. The containment is so important. So I really caution people against doing this thing. I know this thing that happens, right? Because I've lived in moldy places and had to get out of them, and I watch what's happening in my mind, and it just makes me so empathetic towards my patients because we get these tests back, and it's like, this is the problem, like, and we can launch into this like, I'm gonna kill the mold, but we really have to be careful because what the whole thing that a remediator really needs to do to fix the problem is actually get to the source, that colony source of where it's happening. Well, if we're doing these home things and all of a sudden we're spreading spores around and now there's these little colonies all over the
Oh,
place,
God.
it actually can make it a lot more of an expensive job and a lot harder of a job for that inspector and remediator because they might have a harder time. They might have to do more tests, rip out more walls, do these things to find it because we've done these things to actually spread it around. So, step number one, when we get these tests back, really is don't freak out, call a professional. And they can oftentimes walk you through. Like I have one patient right now that has it's literally 150-page report of all the problems in her house that are mold related. So again, it's a threshold thing, right? With this, we're trying to get that threshold down as far as the count. So this patient's not in the position where she can move out. There's no other option. So, remediation has to be. So what we're doing is we're working with the remediator to say, okay, well, these are the rooms that seem to be the worst, that are the rooms that she spends the most time in. So they're containing those first, fixing those first. And then we're going to go back and say, okay, well, is that enough to make those urinary mycotoxin levels, come down? Retest those hormones. Is that now what's there below a threshold of tolerance? So we're working kind of step by step. And so from a standpoint of like, oh, what can we do right away? we can do things in stages and see how much we can actually get done to get below that threshold. And maybe it's a whole project, maybe it's not. But that's where you really want to work with that professional, that inspector, that remediator that truly knows what they're doing so that they're actually moving your house towards health and not making the whole situation worse.
Gosh, yeah, I'm so glad that we touched on that because we do talk about DIY solutions oftentimes, and it can be very appealing. So that's so helpful. So let's just jump to libido. Libido and stress. What I would love to know, Dr. Diane, is the interconnected relationship between chronic illnesses like Lyme and mold and libido. Is there a connection? How are hormones impacted by these conditions, and how do we address that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Sometimes I have people ask me the question of like, how do I get into these very like different areas? But as we know in holistic health, there really is no separation in many ways, that like everything is connected. And libido and sexual health was, if I had never gotten sick and really sick from Lyme and mold, I probably would have had libido as my major foundational, say, area right from the beginning, because I feel like with so much of what we're doing in medicine, whereas like as we get into like biohacking and lifestyle and anti-aging and all these terms and all these ways of doing things that are coming out, and we're talking about maximizing sleep, and we're talking about intermittent fasting, we're talking about autophagy, and we're talking about all these lifestyle types of processes, we're like super holistic, right? We're looking at sleep, we're looking at diet, we're looking at so many different things, nervous system, meditation. But sexual health is still this area that is still like taboo and is still not made its way into this conversation much,
Very true.
which is amazing to me because intimacy, whether we're talking about sex, whether we're talking about cuddling, whether it's just that level of intimacy that is that physical contact, when we release oxytocin, which we do in that, it's the master regulatory hormone.
Mm.
It regulates our happy hormones, it regulates our stress hormones, it regulates our sex hormones. So there's so many things that come back online. And so that's one of the big inner ties between things like libido and chronic illness, is if we go back to even to like phase one of my 4-phase matrix with chronic illness, where it's that rebuilding. Well, part of that rebuilding is like, how do we break the stress cycle? And we can talk about meditation and all these things, and all those things are useful, but we can also like cuddle, and we can also be intimate. And as 20 years of meditating and being in that world, and I think even after 20 years of doing it, it is just nowhere near as fun as intimacy, right? So it's like from a standpoint of like motivation to do things to like connect with our partner and really help, like another interplay with this is like the level of stress that relationships take on during chronic illness. Like I wish we were talking more about chronic illnesses being diseases that actually happen to partners, because
Mm.
while there's one person with disease, of course, they're the person that is truly suffering, but a partner can get sprung into caretaker role, into like basically losing their partner. And obviously, when we're so sick and where we can't even function, we're not going to think about sex. We're not going to think about true libido from that standpoint. But the other relationship here, and that why I think it's so important, is how can we actually work during this chronic illness, during the situation where we often become as partners, like, sufferer and caregiver? How can we actually, during that time, still find a level of intimacy, even if it's not sex, but other types of intimacy to actually bring that relationship closer, to generate that oxytocin, to keep that bond? So it's not that the chronic illness is destroying relationships. And, I've seen that. And I've seen that in my practice where somebody comes in really sick, and by the end of, their journey, their relationship has been so stressed that then they're at divorce.
Mm.
And so that's part of the passion I have with this too is, we know how high divorce rates are, and we put certain stressors like chronic illness, and that does no favor. So how can we actually be talking about this in a way where we're breaking down and we're breaking through the taboo, where we're making this a normal thing to talk about for health, but we're also bringing in that level of intimacy. So when we're going through chronic illness, we can actually become closer instead of further apart.
It's so important too, because so many providers, they say focus on your relationships, prioritize your social outings and such. But we don't talk about that intimacy piece. And so I think you're really shining a light on all these aspects that holistic providers talk about, but really don't help guide you in. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that's huge. I mean, right? Like if our relationships are failing, how are we truly going to get better if we don't have that support system and that intimacy? So I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was gonna say the same thing. I really don't see too many, practitioners that shed light in this area, like Emmy said, they're like, "Work on your relationships. Don't stress," and
But
it's like,
how?
that's not helpful. Like, what do you mean, "Don't stress, don't" So I'm really happy that you're diving into that space and really providing, some guidance and some education there. I love it. Um and I know we're coming up on the hour here, so I did wanna squeeze in a question about your book. So I know we've talked a little bit about it, and now I wanna read it myself, but what prompted you to actually go out and write it, and what key messaging do you hope readers will take away from the book?
Few different things. One was for my own way of categorizing my own research. So some of it is just I read so many studies and then it's so a place like I wrote it in part for people and then also for me as a doctor as well as for other clinicians because it's a place where it's like, oh, what was that study or what did I see on that mycotoxin? So it also serves as my own resource guide for studies I've read. So some of it was just like, if I'm going to categorize this anyways, I efficiency is a core value of mine. So I'm going to categorize and read these studies anyways. I might as well put it in this format. But another big thing was really to answer a lot of questions that come up and really help both provider and patient with certain things. Like, for example, there's a chapter in here called, it's about picking your doctor. It's called Doctor Hopping, When to Shop and When to Stop. And
Mm,
essentially, one of the things I was seeing is so many people would come in, not so many, but a portion of people would come into my practice and they had been to so many doctors. And I'd have these conversations around, like, okay, I think we're missing this. I think we're missing this. I'm thinking about one person. She was with me for a month and she's like, well, she had listened to a podcast. And on this podcast, they said, well, if you don't start with parasites, nothing's ever going to work. And she got really upset with me because we hadn't started with parasites and she had heard this. She went to another doctor that said that they were going to start with parasites. And a month later, I got my staff got information from her wanting us to forward her records, not to that doctor, but yet to the next
mm,
doctor that she had moved on to. So there's this doctor hopping thing that I think happens sometimes for patients where I get it. Like they're anxious. They're like looking for that thing. But what I really found was like a way of actually helping people understand the questions to ask. So they knew if their clinician, they knew if their provider like got them, and they knew if their provider like, bring your questions like, hey, I read this on or heard this on a podcast. What are the pros and cons about this? Why would we consider that? Why would we not? How to make it more collaborative? So it's really helping both, like I said, both clinician and patient for some of those things, in addition to treatment strategies and also to just dispel myths. This thing online of like, oh, I'm having a Herx reaction, I'm having a die-off reaction to things. And all of a sudden, I'm supposed to just like suck it up and supposed to push through it. And even though I can barely even open my eyes in the morning, I'm supposed to lay here and 10x my pain. And I just don't see that working. So I really wanted to give people solutions and strategies for how to work to avoid hercs as much as possible, how to do things in an order where I see that largely being avoided because of not wanting to inflame the body more, which is what I see is happening when people are actually having those die-off reactions.
I love the point you made about the doctor shopping, because I think that can be really easy to do with a chronic condition and when you're feeling feelings of frustration and it's like new shiny object and all of that. Well, this has been such an amazing episode. I do wanna wrap up here. So before we close, I do like to ask all of our providers kind of the same question, just to get to know you a little bit better. So what does it mean to you to live a vibrant life?
I love this question. What a great question. To have the energy and the vitality to do what I wanna do when I wanna do it.
Mm.
So, I this year, I snowboarded 32 days, to
Wow.
have the energy and the vitality to do that, to show up for the people I love in my life, to provide amazing care for my patients, and to really continue to live my purpose in life and to be able to go to bed, sleep well, wake up with the energy and the happiness to do it all over again.
And that vibrancy, it's coming through the screen in the conversation. It's just you're
Absolutely.
radiating. I love it.
Mm.
And where can our listeners find you if they want to connect with you, work with you, or order your book?
Yeah, my book is available on Amazon. We have a lot of promotional stuff happening this May of 2024 for Lyme Disease Awareness Month. So it's Not in Your Mind by Dr. Diane Mueller. And an easy thing to get started with me is just go take my quiz, getwellquiz.com. Go take that. That'll also get you on my list for all the promotional activity that's going on and get you in connection with me and my team.
Amazing. Well, we will make sure for our listeners tuning in today that we link this down in the show notes so that you have some easy access to it. And Dr. Diane, thank you so much again for coming on the podcast today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. And until next week, wishing you all vibrant health and wellness.
Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness Podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guest and host are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.